Hello and welcome to the Realm of Ideas is Free to All. My name is Bruce Gemmel, and I'm here in New York City. And this is a series of ruminations I have regarding my ideas as they relate to architecture and other various things. This is a redo from the work I had done previously and on the platform, but this is kind of like the second go around, and there's been some kind of changes. But anyway, what started with the idea of the operation of the metaphor, a kind of consequential idea within my work, and then into basic principles of what that it was and how the metaphor was actually, I believe, not a kind of operation of language as much as just a kind of process of nature that has an analogy in language. And what we no, excuse me, know initially as a thanks pedal, what we know as an operation of language in an art is actually something that's a process that happens in nature. So I went through those things, the natural, what I call the organic metaphor, the artificial or aesthetic metaphor, and then unbreakable bonds, which I kind of see as a kind of like a proto metaphor or a social metaphor. Went from there to a series of ideas of like criticism, the nature of criticism, and a view of criticism, an indicator of societal health. What I started to realize is that certain principles that exist in civilization exist there and can be tested in terms of the firmness of their foundation within the greater society. From there, we talked about architecture as a verb. Now I see it as a process. Drawing towards and then towards an organic architecture, which was basically what I propose my work is. There's a series of then we talked about authority of ideas. Then we talked about my past architecture, which was basically, I guess, my kind of like founding principles in terms of like growing up and finding myself. Then we had my recent past architecture, which was basically my architectural education, and then continue on as a professor, and then the aftermath, which was a generation of what I call organic design thinking. Then we kind of went back and talked about the idea of the proto-metaphor or kind of unbreakable bonds as indicators of societal health, emotional attachment to ideas, understanding of judgments, and then what is an unbreakable bond. From there, we worked through a series of principles about what it was, how it operates, and kind of things to be aware of. Talked about principles. Allergies are pretty bad right now. And we talked about some principles in truth, beauty, and love, which kind of took me to the end of that first series that I kind of redid. From there, I kind of started with this last group, which is the pieces that we're on now. I started with the ideas of kind of like organic and inorganic aspects of my work. The organic aspects being that which is the desire for actually kind of creating organism, what I call organism, and then kind of relating that to what I would call mechanism, which is the situation that I kind of find myself in operating mostly. So from there, we talked about measurement last week, and this week we're going to talk about the nature of perspective within the metaphor. And what I'm going to do is kind of talk about the idea of point of view and perspective as an operation within the operation of the metaphor. So to kind of like talk about that. So what I'm going to do is kind of talk about the fact that the metaphor is a device that provides a point of view, and that it can be used to kind of like create kind of deeper consequential understanding of things, and also talk about the fact that the point of view is part of the generative strategy of that itself. Now, to go back to what we talked about, the metaphor is an operation where things of complexity come from things of simplicity, and that concepts kind of combine to form new concepts. And that through that operation, we kind of see the advancement of nature and also the potential advancement of society. Okay, so that's our general introduction. So now we will talk about this week in Julie. So Puddle, do you want to kind of come and give us a recap of this week in Julie?
Yeah.
Okay, so where are we? What are we up to?
Oh, I'll talk about what I'm up to, then I'll bring my piece. Yes?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, we have lots of interesting things going on.
Good.
Yes.
Tell us.
Well, here's an interesting challenge.
Hmm.
When I don't ever call them sketches. When I'm doing the plan, I'm going to call it. Is your eye okay?
Whatever it is, something's kind of gotten in the corner of my eye, and I have not been able to dislodge it. I'll figure it out later.
Use a Q-tip later and get it out.
We can do that later. Yeah.
We have lots of Q-tips
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of good light.
Right. Okay.
I will get it out for you.
Okay.
So you don't worry
Yep.
about it. So I don't call it a sketch. I mean, it looks actually more like a pretty finished drawing, but it's really the blueprint for my painting. And I do those at the Met too. I do my paintings here in our studio.
Mm-hmm.
But here's an interesting challenge when, oh no.
It's fine.
Sure. Okay, I'll cut it out for you. I have a lot of stuff in that too. I understand. When you have a dimension that's not readily known, that's still in flux, it's actually very exciting because the parameters of my painting are not known yet. And the 9x12 paper that both Bruce, pardon.
Not to worry.
Okay, I could have gotten it before we started. The 9x12 Strathmore 400 series drawing paper that we both use is a given size, and our drawings that we do at the Met are always on that size of paper. But my painting is not going to be that size, nor the dimensions. So I'm building out from it, and Bruce had a great idea and was a huge help. And I was trying to kind of draw on my own thigh, which doesn't really work, and draw out on this topic. There is a sculpture at the Met I've always been absolutely fascinated by on the first floor of Baron Schmiedel, who is in fact not a baron at all. I think I mentioned him in a previous broadcast. He was a court jester for Augustus of Austria, I believe, and Bruce and I were talking, if you'd like to say, about what it would be like being a jester, being at the whims of some completely fickle, capricious person like a king who held your life in their hands.
Right.
So what do you think, Huddle?
I think that one of the great things about America is the fact that we have some social liberties and some sense of self-determination and certain autonomies. And I think that the idea is certainly not that we're certainly not free of tyranny completely. But at the same time, when I look around at other places, I kind of see as if that tyranny is much greater than it is here. There are things in business and in things like that where people, even in their domestic lives, find themselves somewhat imprisoned to relationships. One of the reasons why I feel as if social liberties really need to be kind of enacted and kind of like emancipated and kind of granted is because it allows for freedom. I mean, freedom to emancipate your freedom so that you basically kind of have the greatest ability to operate within it. Now, again, let me clarify what I mean by that. Social liberties are those things granted by a government or a state or some kind of like governing body, as opposed to freedom, which is a kind of metaphysical reality that one contends with. Like, for instance, one needs to cross the road, or one needs to buy groceries, or one needs to kind of like, whatever. But there's these kind of endless challenges and opportunities that come with the kind of like moving forward or, in your life. That is the freedom that I speak about. Now, a lot of times people kind of will say, we need freedom, we have freedom. And I think what they really mean is social liberty. Social liberty is that sense that you're granted this privilege, this opportunity. You can speak what you feel you need to speak about. You can act in a way that gives you a certain bodily autonomy and doesn't allow the state to kind of take away certain rights about your sovereignty. So that's kind of, I think, what I think is important to mean by that. Now, in the case of Baron Schmiedel, Schmiedel,
Schmiedel.
in the case of Baron Schmiedel,
Is that okay?
I don't know,
All right.
but what I see is the fact that, like, he is at the whim of this individual, completely at the complete, isolation of his entire life.
Yeah.
And, we talk about the fact that we were talking about Scheherazade and the kind of parallel to the
Yeah, that was
story.
a really good
And,
analogy.
The fact that in spite of the incredible opulence and luxury that you live in, it's really kind of overbearing when one doesn't have the ability to think about the possibility of tomorrow.
Yeah.
And that's kind of one of the things that I think, Baron Schmiedel,
Schmiedel with an M.
has to contend with,
Which
as
wasn't
was
his real
the
name.
case of,
Yeah.
Scheherazade.
Yeah. May I say, people, even the annals of history, wiped out his real identity. I did a lot of research and found it. I can get the name, but even the text at the Met doesn't give his real name. I did a lot of hunting, and he was called a baron in quite a facetious way, in a mocking way, because he was dressed like a baron, but it was finery that was loaned to him by the king and the court and would be taken away at any moment. And in fact, his partner, his comedic partner, suddenly pulled a prank on the king and was imprisoned and was about to be executed when he escaped. And they planned a prank that seemed to go over well, and he just happened to get back into the good graces of the king, who was obviously an incredibly fickle guy. And the painting has to do with what is the chemical, psychological, emotional, and physical nature of fear and transference of fear. And I bring that up because not only was this court jester in constant fear of his life, being imprisoned, being exiled, being executed, but he was forced to perform for the king. And he went on hunts. He was in the bedroom of the king. He was at a set with 4 trained mice. Now, we assume, looking at it in the sculpture, the mice are, one of them is hanging out of his mouth by his tail. One of them is in his vest, another's hanging off his tricorn hat. It turns out he had a dread fear of rodents and that he hated the mice. And the mice, in fact, needed him because if they didn't live this opulent life in court, they would probably not survive for very long outside, given the birds and the cats and everything else that was around.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, they it seems like this is that they preferred to live in the kind of like in inside, but I mean, it came with its own
they were
difficulties.
In constant fear that if
so
he
the
was
thing
out,
is,
then so were they.
Yeah, if they kind of like had this situation where if they didn't continue to perform, they would be turned out into a situation that basically had its own issues.
Or fed to the royal cats, or
whatever. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So what happened was, I mean, I think what you decided was you were going to have them as a kind of series of as a series of kind of like puppet masters that were going to manipulate the Baron so as if he would be able to kind of continue to be compelling and entertaining to the point where he would survive, because the mice basically, I mean, in your telling of the story, what you're saying is the mice basically take charge because they have no faith in Schmiedel to be able to keep them safe, but they do see the fact that the king or the emperor, what is he? Is it king?
Yeah,
is
King
incredibly
Augustus, I believe.
Is incredibly insipid and can easily be deceived.
Yes.
So that they kind of take that as their kind of objective.
So in this drawing, I've already drawn it in. I built a grotto into the chest of Baron Schmiedel, into the jester's chest of predation, of fear, using a sculpture of an owl that is literally tearing apart and disemboweling a mouse, and a number of fear-based animal predator-prey relationships. And I'm going to build an observatory that the mice are actually observing the gesture
Mm.
from and controlling and experimenting on him. Anyway, so I built it out per your really good idea, and then you were going to embed it in a much larger
Right.
sheet of
So
paper.
you can actually use it to work on it till you
Yeah.
got it kind of completed. And then, so let's take this opportunity now,
Yeah.
because we were having this conversation earlier at the Met with a colleague about the process of how that, though this is a sketch and you don't like to use the term sketch, you prefer the term drawing, which it actually is. This is different than a finished drawing that will basically be its own end result.
Yeah.
This is actually something that has a kind of connection to and is a pendant piece. Well, actually, not a pendant piece at all, because
It's
it's a precursor, right? So the thing is, what happens is that you will develop from this sketch the final painting. So
Yes.
this is a kind of an intermediate step. What happened?
I got a splinter.
Oh no.
Yeah.
So this is an intermediate step
Yeah.
between the initial generation of the ideas of the piece and the final painting.
Yes.
So it's kind of it's not
for...
independent like a drawing would be. It's
True.
basically dependent as a developmental piece for the painting itself.
Yes.
Okay.
And I will make, as we said to our colleague at the Met, I will be adding things, I'll be changing things, not the main big things, certain compositional things, maybe some proportional things, but it will basically have all the components that I'm building in. Now, also, I'm building in a number of lichen species, and I'm going to build in some highly toxic, fear-inducing mushrooms.
Okay,
Yes.
question.
Okay, yeah.
Now, in terms of the process by which you will kind of alter or you'll kind of adapt the drawing to the painting. Now, the first thing I would say is noticeable is the fact that it's a graphite black and white drawing, which is basically used to kind of generate a watercolor painting.
Yes.
So aside from that, I guess we could call that a translation, or we could call it a kind of transcription.
That's a good
so
word.
in terms of the transcription from black and white to color and from pencil to paint, what other types of, given the fact that you've done this process before, what other types of things do you see that kind of happen in the course of going from the sketch to the painting, aside from, say, the kind of like the transcriptions of color and paint?
Excellent question. A number of interpretations must be manifested. So the graphite is supremely great for mapping out the cartography of the emotional and physical landscape of the painting. It's great at mass and form, where things are, the properties. And yes, if you go into the detail, as I would if this were a standalone finished drawing, I mean, this is a fairly detailed drawing, as our colleague and you both pointed out.
Right.
The intricacies, the interplay of texture, which is very important, will come in much more in the watercolors. Depth of field, using color as structure is very important, and that will come in really in the watercolor painting. I mean, a lot of things blend together much more now in graphite, because I'm not trying to do extreme areas of contrast, because it's not a standalone drawing. I want the clarity to be there. I'm not going as much for the dramatic interludes if this were a drawing in and of itself.
Yeah, it reminds me of something I heard recently about the fact that someone said, and this relates to me, is the fact that, like, architects, people say, like, oh, architects made this building, or architects made that building. And what this person said was, architects don't make buildings. And in fact, they don't.
Yeah.
I mean, contractors make buildings. What architects make are models and drawings. So, what happens is, I understand the process related aspect of model building and drawing. And in fact, one of the things that kind of we do with organic design thinking is kind of operate those things as kind of as kind of codependent kind of like aspects of a process that allow one to basically kind of begin to kind of create operations for the others, so that one kind of says like, okay, if this is this, what potential lies in the next step? So I understand that idea that, you know, what I think in this case our colleague was thinking was that this is a static finished thing, and it was a problem for him that something that had this very provocative sensual quality was not the end result and was not a kind of fixed thing, but was part of the process. I, on the other hand, completely understand that, because I mean, my drawings and models are kind of like stages, even amongst themselves.
We're gonna put that over here.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
So, you know, that's kind of something that I think allows us to kind of get into this topic here. So, if you have anything else you want to add about that, if not, we'll kind of start to go into our topic here. But if you want to kind of,
I guess the interesting thing is, I'm also going to have pieces of finery that are jutting out and buried in the fern and moss grotto in Baron Schmiedel's Jester chest. And I'm using pieces from his age, from his very time, Meissen, which is some of the most interesting soft paste and hard paste porcelain ever made, I think. That's important to that. Oh no. Did you catch it?
Yep.
Okay, so I have a painting in mind once you introduce our topic.
Right. Okay. So like I said, the topic today is the nature of perspective within the metaphor, and it's called Generative. The subtitle is Generative Strategy of Uncovering Consequence. And the way I see it is there's two aspects, and we talked about the metaphor as a series of kind of like an operation of going to kind of intricacy and complexity from simplicity. We talked about the fact that this happens naturally. This happens in the natural world, and we can see it. We can see it in evolution. We can see it in kind of symbiogenesis. We can see it in kind of like physics, chemistry, on and on and on and on. And that we kind of understood it as something that we suspected we had discovered as an operation of language, as an independent thing. But in fact, it doesn't. It's actually an analogy, given that from its natural state. So that the artificial, or what I call the artificial metaphor, that which we understand in language and art, actually is just simply a reflection of something that's much more impinged, much more in, deep seated within, the operation of embedded, within the nature of within the aspects of the natural world. So, given that the perspective, one of the things that gives rise to the aspect of consequence in the metaphor is, one, the fact that once the metaphor is created, it can often give us a deeper understanding of things within the natural world. So it in itself affords a perspective. It is a viewing platform towards the natural world. The second thing is, in its generation, right, it actually acts the same way, as if a perspective is necessary in order to generate it. So we can go more into that, but that's basically the premise.
A very interesting word to apply to this premise. The word is nef.
What's that?
N-E-F-F.
What is nef?
Nef is a perspectival symbol of power. And there are a number
N-E-F-F?
Yeah, I believe it's two F's. It might just be one. It's N-E-F or N-E-F-F. I can look it up. You can look it up on your phone. So a nef was often in the shape of an elaborate ship. And I believe it's a French word, and it was used in France. And this elaborate ship made of gold or sterling silver with incredible amounts of detail was put at the place setting at the head of the table. Two F's, right?
I haven't found it.
Yeah, I think I just saw it. Of the king, of the head of the table, to signify their place. Now this goes right back to perspective. Who is the head of the group? Who's the head of the table? if you pass a neff or put a neff at the place setting of a baron, are they the head of a count, of the queen, of the king, of a courtier, of, say, a concubine who wields a huge amount of power, of a knight who wields it? I mean, it's a really fascinating thing. So there were these, it's almost like a place setting is the determinant of social perspective.
It's
an object.
it's a physical
It's a
object.
physical object.
It's not a social kind of distinction. Or it's like it's not an aspect of social order. It's an aspect of social order.
Also.
Okay, because when I'm looking it up and it's kind of doesn't show up here, is like Neff name meaning and Neff family history of family search, relationship name from, it says here, Neff is short for nephew, right? Neve, nephew. Later, rather broadening to application like cousin or English. So it does talk about the idea of a social order.
That's different. It's not understanding.
Maybe
Put in not Neff meaning, Neff French object, Neff at the Neff place setting for a king.
Mm-hmm.
It was specifically used to determine and denote a social order, and it was often a boat or sailing ship, very, very elaborate. And the perspective was anybody that sat with a neff, their perspective was the right perspective.
The neff,
yes,
Old French for ship,
that's it,
was an important element of the medieval table setting. It was a boat-shaped container that was set on the table and was used to hold elements of the place setting. The use of the ship form is believed to symbolize good fortune and fair sailing on the uncertain seas of life. Okay.
Yeah, and
so these are objects, but they also basically are
they're social
distinctions.
Oh yeah,
so it's kind of like a kind of aspect of social order.
It's like a crown. I mean, it's the crown of the So the observation platform is a neff in my painting.
Okay. Oh, so it'll be basically it'll be a ship.
Oh yeah.
It'll have a kind of like that kind of view.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So what do you think of, or what are your questions, or what do you think of this idea that I've kind of like, laid down here in terms of the idea of the perspective as an aspect of the metaphorical of the operation of the metaphor?
Well, I think there are many facets to the perspective. I'd like to bring up a couple of them.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to bring up the physical perspective versus perception. So when you have a perspective and you are seeing a space, let's say, oh, thank you. That's so nice. Say you are seeing a space in a certain way. Let's take a tea room. Based on not just the built environment, the beams, there were a lot of rituals. Certain things had to be in certain proportions, made with certain woods. The perspective of, is this a neophyte to the ceremony? Is this someone who is a master of tea? Is this a tourist that is simply a visitor, a gawker, maybe someone who doesn't understand? Therefore, the perspective of the participant will govern tremendously how they perceive the physicality of the architecture and the space.
Mm-hmm.
And the perspective, and I'm going to just jump for a minute to emotional states and to the accruement of disappointments or expectations or loss on a societal scale. And I did a painting about exactly this, which is one that I chose for the perspectives, which will alter in one's mind the very architecture, the very engineering, the physicality of your environment based on the perspective of your emotional and psychological state at the time.
Okay. So how would you do that? How would you make that manifest?
Would you like me to bring that in? That's
sure.
Manifesting.
Yeah.
Would you like to talk about it now? So the topic more.
Yeah, well, that's just it. So the
Yeah.
thing is, I kind of think that, as we've talked about, what happens is the metaphor is generated by the kind of taking of two things to generate something that's
Mhm.
new and independent.
Right.
And the that is something that we can kind of recognize. We can recognize it in terms of, like, form. We can see it in nature, and we can see it in we can see it in art. We can see it in literature.
Mhm.
We can also see it in the fact that, like, these combinations of concepts that form new concepts become things that kind of also have a kind of structural characteristic in
Yeah.
terms of the way in which we structure society.
Mhm.
Certain unbreakable bonds exist and are and give progress and benefit to
Mhm.
society, and other ones, sometimes when they're lost,
Mhm.
the society kind of crumbles. I think that we've given the example before where someone basically says, in any particular time, technique has to have a correlation to what is the thing which basically guides its generation and
Mhm.
its operation. You did the painting with Abisu, and how Abisu kind of
Yeah.
regulates order over the world within the fishermen and the fish.
Yeah.
But in the case of, like, the combination of, say, technique and religion, technique and superstition, technique and kind of, like, irrational kind of consequence, we've understood how that has existed in kind of more kind of fundamental times. But now we understand that in our case, we have been able to kind of say we would rather have technique or technology kind of linked in an unbreakable bond with science or rationality. So
Mhm.
as a result, we've been able to see the benefit that there's certain things you can do in
Mhm.
this relationship that you couldn't do in a previous relationship.
Mhm.
You have desires, you have things that you want to achieve, and you use
Mhm.
technique to accomplish that. The thing is, because of the engine of that technique, which
Mhm.
now in this case is would be science, experimentation, reason, rationalization, rationalizing, logic, we can see certain capabilities, like the ability to predict and improve and benefit the technology through
Mhm.
experimentation. With, for instance, material science, we can get to the point where we can understand how to make our sword lighter, quicker, faster, and more deadly,
Yeah.
sharper. So we
Mhm.
can basically find these things out. We can literally get these things to happen.
Mhm.
Whereas before, we didn't know how, except by chance, to be able to kind of make any improvements. And in fact, a lot of the things
Mhm.
we did were actually kind of like completely really absurd.
Mhm.
We would say that if we would sacrifice virgins, or if we would sacrifice livestock, or sacrifice something, that somehow we would benefit by kind of pleasing the gods, that somehow
Well,
beneficial things would happen, which we now realize was absurd. It never happened.
well,
Hmm? Say.
well, here's a great segue
Okay.
opportunity. Um, I watch a lot of news and cultural shows
Hmm.
on NHK World, a great channel,
Mm-hmm.
the Japanese channel. It's my favorite. Sure, get on. I've learned a lot of things about intricacies of Japanese culture,
Hmm.
which is ritual and belief structures. As technologically advanced, and the Japanese really are. I mean, they're way out in front on robots and drones, and I mean, their cuisine, their science, their medicine. Yet, there is still, from what I have observed, a very strong animalistic, deistic culture. Very, very strong. Their prayers to the gods by people who would not normally be seen as religious. There are rituals for almost everything, not just drinking tea, not just drinking sake. There are rituals of the seasons, rituals for birth, rituals for girls. There's Girls' Day, there's Boys' Day, rituals for the seasons, which brings me to some of the great metaphors. Wagashi are the metaphors and the avatars of the seasons.
Hmm.
And these confections, which have been around since the 15th or 16th century, use and craft out of white bean paste, out of chestnuts, out of soy, these amazing
Hmm.
pieces. So a persimmon becomes a metaphor for the fall and all that goes with the change of the fall.
Hmm. Hmm.
A pine tree with crystallized ice becomes the symbol of winter, and a cube with koi and seaweed is a metaphor for the summer. But there are thousands of them, so clusters, families of metaphors, and Japan is incredibly based on a seasonal belief structure and cycle even today.
Hmm. No, I understand that, but
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
that it's maybe its ability to become. I mean, there's a different. No one in. I mean, it's possible. I mean, in terms of medicine or kind of science or things like that, I don't know how many of the scientists are actually praying to the gods. But
Oh
in
no.
terms of like, it seems like more that there's been. It seems more that they rely on reason and
Well,
rationality,
yeah, yeah, but it's
and
still very
experimentation.
prevalent in
Oh, absolutely.
Japanese
I mean, look, I
society,
mean,
from what I've seen.
cultures have their desires and they have
Hmm.
their aspirations. I mean, one of the things we talked about, we've talked about before, is
Hmm.
the fact that, like, David Hume in the Treatise on Human Nature
Hmm.
talks about the fact that we need to understand that our desires, not rationality, is what moves us. It's the impulse that allows us to kind of move in a particular direction and have certain aspirations. That rationalization can be a benefit to us, but
Hmm.
it isn't itself an engine. And I use the example, the fact that they always talked about in classic Star Trek, which is to me the only real Star Trek,
Yeah, it's great.
where the Vulcans basically came to understand logic, is what kind of stopped them from being savage people. Now, what I think happened was the Vulcans understood the fact that their passions and desires, without some kind of regulator, right, could not be tamed. But by using kind of logic and reason, they came to understand the kind of the benefits of certain actions over others. Now, again, that doesn't necessarily mean that one has to be in a culture exactly the way the Vulcans were. But I
Well,
mean, in a way, you could kind of say that we, by taking our technique and kind of like applying it as an operation with reason or with technology being linked to science rather than superstition, right? And that was my point, was that
mm,
the techniques of how one made brushes, one could basically test certain hairs, one could look
hmm,
at them, see how they operate, look at, under a microscope, look at it, kind of make applications and see
hmm,
how it's actually applying to paint, understand chemistry, and
hmm.
understand the fact that certain hydrations would kind of create certain kind of pigments, and kind of certain densities of kind of like saturation.
Oh, it's an exacting and beautiful science.
Exactly. So the thing is, science gives you this ability to kind of get a perspective that you wouldn't have if you're just basically appealing to a higher order.
Oh, I
I mean,
agree.
in fact, I mean, you're not appealing to a higher order. You're investigate the idea of that order could be at all,
And
because the
then,
idea is, the
yeah.
assumption is that there
Hmm.
is an order, and there are principles that can be understood. That's what I
Hmm.
think gives that aspect.
Well, true. And then you have a lusty and very emotional and violent version of the Vulcans, which are the Romulans.
Hmm.
And they are the brothers and the sisters and the cousins of the
Hmm.
Vulcans. In fact, they
Hmm.
are an offshoot of the
Hmm.
Vulcans
Hmm.
without, with emotions.
True.
Yeah.
True. Yeah.
Shall I get it? My painting?
Yeah. Sure.
Or I have to unplug my iPad fast
Okay.
because it's overcharging. So
Hmm.
I don't want to
Okay.
overcharge it. I'll be right back.
So, for me, one of the things that generally benefits me is the fact that in my architecture, I found that the point of view, the operation by which I wanted to express my visual kind of like delineations was from a point of view rather than come from this kind of. There wasn't a there was a fixation with ortho with like axisymmetric and isometric projections, and these kind of abstractions where there is no specific point of view, but there is an orientation with something where you kind of like never really had a sense of operating yourself within the circumstance. I felt part of it had to do with the fact that, there was a certain intricacy and complexity that had to go along with the ability to generate perspective. But at the same time, I felt that there was a certain desire among architects not to kind of like have an understanding of, points of view or point of view. So for me, I think that was kind of one of the things that kind of like led me down this path. So I look at it like, I think that when one comes to understand something, one of the things that they benefit from is kind of looking from that point of view that can reveal something that isn't necessarily obvious, but is compelling. Now, I've used the example before using my kind of Rubik's Cube, is that if I say to the person who's on the other side of the screen, actually it's kind of bleached out, what color do you see? They see green, I see blue, right? We're both right, right? If someone says, well, what color do you see? Well, if the person's on the other side of the screen, they see green, I see blue. I don't see green except I see it in the screen, but in my eye, I see that. So I look at it that if I say, what do I see? It's like I see a square, and I'm like, I've wrote it like, no, I see a cube. And again, this is the difference. We talked about this in the relationship between truth and honesty. We're going to be talking about honesty, but for a separate reason in a couple of weeks. And that's because I feel as if like it's a kind of an issue that's under kind of siege, and it's kind of like one of the things that needs to be addressed. But anyway, the point is coming to a compelling point of view, right, is something that kind of lends benefit.
Right.
Is that someone is able to kind of like render something that gives a point of view that allows a deepening of the understanding. And it's kind of almost ironic in the fact that going from a greater perspective to a kind of like another to a limiting of that perspective would be able to do that. You would think the opposite would be, that's counterintuitive, the opposite would be true, but it's not. So you want to introduce us to what we have here?
Sure. Would you like to hold it up?
Sure.
Can you hold it up?
Mm-hmm.
I think you're in a better position to hold it up. So this painting is called Wagashi Trap Single Cell Atlas for a Fifth Season. So single cell atlas comes from single cell genomics, which, if you're unfamiliar with it, is the idea, a really excellent one, a really, really innovative one, that to peer into the form, the substance, the content, the characteristics, the functions, and the realities of a single cell to get a picture of a whole organ, of an organism, of an entity, of a disease state, has much more of a value than looking at a massive piece of something like a tissue sample, meaning you're going micro to find a solution, not macro. And going smaller and smaller, you can actually see more and get much more of a sense. In fact, we did some work with an organization out west. Oh, sorry, Puddle.
Okay.
And I shouldn't say which, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Nah.
They're a well-known genomics institute. That's what I'll say.
In San Diego.
Yes.
People would know who they were.
People would definitely know. And I was commissioned to do a painting by the director, and it was visualizing his work in single cell genomics. And as his specialty was to search for a cure for multiple sclerosis. Now, in this painting, single cell atlas is what it sounds like, to basically think of a huge compendium, but to understand the breadth of a tome, you may understand it more fully, more completely, more beautifully, peering into a single cell than reading every single page.
Hmm.
And in this case, the fifth season is I created a fifth unknowable as yet uninvented season outside of our four known spring, summer, fall, and winter, which are the seasons, obviously, that are exemplified by various types of Japanese wagashi or confections, which are avatars of the season, and they're always served and eaten as part of the tea ceremony. And the idea is this was during COVID when we all had the expectation that, oh, things are finally going to open up, and then nothing opened up. This will be open for another hour, and it wasn't. We can go outside again. No, you can't. You have a curfew. I mean, we all found it absolutely excruciating. I certainly did. So that accruement where you never knew, can I get back to the Met soon? Can I get back to our drawing? Can we go out again and eat in a restaurant? Can we interact with other people without wearing a mask? That accruement in my mind, formed its own season, a fifth season, which was more a portal than a place of being, which was the accruements of the disappointments collectively, which formed its own season as a gateway to a very unknown, trepidous place that had yet to be fully formed. Sorry, Pamela.
Mhm.
So, in fact, I used Frank Lloyd Wright's model of the Guggenheim, which was in fact on view at MoMA here, as my model for a wagashi for this fifth invented season. And it was, in fact, a portal. And hanging off it right here is a wagashi, a chrysanthemum, which was one of the many used for autumn. And here you'll see the beam of a tea room built into the Japanese wing at the Met with this giant splash, which was a classic summer wagashi. And you'll see koi and the seaweed, but it is in fact tearing apart the architecture of the tea room. It is going right through the beam, and that dependability, the solidity, the comfort and the confidence of the traditions of the tea house are gone as this thing just breaks through with the properties of a dragon. And all the tatami mats are gone. You only see them in the shadows of the objects used in the tea ceremony. In terms of perspective, I picked this one because I tremendously altered the perspective of the room.
Mhm.
Would you like to see? You are the perfect person to actually speak about how it's altered from what one would have
Well,
architecturally.
one of the things that was interesting was that, like, Escher did a lot of drawings, two-dimensional, three-dimensional, where he basically kind of changed the way in which kind of things read. And what was interesting is, like, people know basic principles of perspective, in terms of usually there's picture planes, there's focal, there's kind of like there's the point of view where you are, there's a picture plane, there are vanishing points, and there are different structural components that are basically placed. So when you come down a hallway, you'd see everything, which is kind of relative to where you see things in real life, is everything kind of telescopes to one point down the hallway. If you see an object kind of at an oblique angle, usually you see the sides moving away to you again towards that horizon line where basically it vanishes to a point. So what happens in this case is you see some of these kind of like, kind of anomalies that one would see in a kind of dream landscape rather than it would actually exist. If we follow this beam here, we see the fact that this piece that looks like it's going in that direction. This is very deceiving because I can never see it here. Oh, let me see
Yeah, I
if I get
know.
it here. Okay,
Do you want
so
me to hold it up?
I got it.
Is that easier?
We see this beam going this way, as if it's basically telescoping away for us. So what we see is we see this plane, as the top plane. This is the side, but at the same time, when we see this piece that's hanging off of it, it now is hanging off the top. So what happens is this side plane here kind of now suddenly becomes the top. That you would kind of see these things, and you see that some of these, there's that you can't really picture, a series of vanishing points that would make sense because these pieces are kind of like projecting and distorted.
And the window is both inside and outside at
yeah.
the same time.
Right, exactly. And then in this case, this piece stops completely and disappears. So you see the fact that these things
As does this wall.
are right, exactly. So you're betrayed because your kind of structural system that you use to kind of make sense of the organization of the visual things in front of you has been suspended or kind of like kind of broken. So I think in that case, the idea is we understand the point of view and we understand it as a personal thing. And I think one of the things that kind of bothered me was the personal aspect was never really that important, or it wasn't allowed to be important into architectural students or architectural studies. So I always found that not only was I kind of like projecting my point of view, right? I actually was kind of you could put your particular, you had your particular height above the plane that you were on as something that would exist as a certain thing, 6 foot as opposed to like 5'7" or 5'9". And then you also realize that you now suddenly had an existence within this concept, which brings me back to this idea of the kind of generation of the metaphor, is that you can use these things once they're generated to kind of be able to kind of like give understanding or kind of like framing or something or some kind of organization to other objects. Once more objects are added to the landscape, they basically kind of complicate and kind of like bring with them subtleties and nuances and meanings that were previously unavailable. But at the same time, when one generates the metaphor, the point of view is that which is the desire of the individual. The combinations that you use, the kind of structures that you impose, are those that are important to you in terms of your particular predilections. I mean, you make the choices to make the combinations and make the things. So regardless of the fact that is there an actual will determination, the idea is these are selected things. And we talked about freedom. One of the things I also felt was really important was that existential idea of freedom was exercised in the way in which someone made choices to place yourself and place yourself within relationships to the object or yourself as an object. So that's kind of what I think to me made this kind of idea, was that, again, my frame of reference is me, right? Relative to other things, relative to time, relative to space, relative to other objects, right? So that to me was always something I felt was necessary to be able to be kind of, understood and preserved. Okay, so now to wrap up, because we have about 5 minutes left here, any last questions, any last things we want to talk about, or anything like you'd like to see?
Point. Yeah. Okay. What if you place yourself within the metaphor and you become those characteristics of the metaphor as objectified by something that now has replaced one idea for another? In this case, the expectation of a renaissance, the expectation of salvation. In this case, spring is always expected to be a time of rebirth, of rejuvenation, where the dead comes back to life, where winter seeds to growth. I mean, it's classically that. And the spring wagashi are symbolic, but what happens when spring is not spring? When spring is just another shape of winter. And that's what this is.
So basically,
Yeah.
so what you're saying is the fact that winter and spring existed simultaneously.
Yes. I
Okay.
mean, what if the deathly hallows of winter, what if the withering of winter, what if it encroaches onto spring? What if it hijacks spring, which is what it did? We all came into a spring during
Let's see.
COVID expecting a reopening, a rebirth, a renaissance, a panacea, a cure, an end to it, a new beginning. But in fact, it crawled in like a slithy toad.
So
to quote Lewis Carroll.
there was a barren point when actually we were actually we should have been regenerating.
Yeah.
That's true, because I remember it
Yeah.
was March and we were kind of like well into the spring, and we decided to kind of shut everything down.
Yes, and that
and
is
kind
the
of like-
metaphor for that. If
Right.
you want to hold it up fast.
Yeah. I also remember like you were
Yeah.
kind of also kind of like became obsessed with the concept of the cholera pie, which
Yeah.
was also something that was in some of the paintings.
Yeah, I don't
Which
want to
was the idea that you made do with what you had because of the fact that there were certain things that were kind of like untenable and kind of unapproachable.
Yeah.
Mm.
And that is a particular type of very famous spring wagashi called a sakura mochi. And the very symbol of spring is the sakura or the cherry blossom.
Right.
The cherry blossom viewing, the cherry blossom festivals that are huge in Japan as the symbol, the avatar and the metaphor of spring
Was suspended.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, and it's like I think that idea that like we were not so we were entering a societal spring which had been suspended as an extended winter.
Right.
And we were kind of in a
crawls
position of kind of suspended animation.
Yeah, like a tattered, like a slug in the garden.
Right. Yeah. So what happened was the sakura mochi became a slug.
It would never look like this when served. It would be perfect and
Right.
verdant and green, and it's not.
So the colors, and it would also not move. It's actually kind of started to kind of like, kind of locomote.
Yeah.
All right. So I think that this wasn't art. This wasn't really maybe as clear as it should have been. But at the same time, I think it was a really valuable discussion. I think that the metaphor, the operation of the metaphor as defined by us is kind of something that we feel very close to, but I kind of think that there probably needs to be returned to different perspectives in which to convey this. But I think point of view as a kind of generative strategy in terms of the fact that looking for those things that you want to use in combination or things that kind of beckon as a possibility is like, hey, in order to get there might be these components that could put it together. As well as the fact that once it's generated, because it's not like an algorithmic or kind of like axiomatic method, you can't predict it, you can't anticipate it, and I think that's because the reality is you can't have infinite points of view, which is the kind of thing that makes the specifics of the point of view very, very valuable because of the fact that you have to basically choose the ones that you think are significant, and finding the ones that kind of are significant and make for a compelling understanding is kind of important. So next week, the topic is, I was looking at that before, it was understanding and judgment as regards authority. And I think that's kind of pertains to communication, but also communication is actually one of the aspects of what artists and architects and speculative individuals do. So without further ado, you want any last things? Want to just say goodbye or?
Oh.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Bye. So the realm of ideas is free to all, and it's to the benefit of all for us to maintain that. Thank you, and we will see you.